Prologue. When Issei was younger, Issei Hayaoru sat on the edge of a worn wooden bench, a curious smile playing on his lips as he watched the other children run about in the playground. Their laughter filled the air, accompanied by the rhythmic creak of swings and the occasional scrape of shoes against gravel. The teachers stood nearby, eyes ever watchful, ensuring that nothing went awry in the midst of the youthful chaos. But Issei was not one for such simple pleasures. Instead, he reclined back, pulling the brim of his hat down to shield his eyes from the afternoon sun, a gesture that made him seem older, almost as if he was in on some secret that the others were too young to understand. His hat, a peculiar green and white striped bucket hat that was far too large for his small head, gave him an air of mystery, something unusual for a boy his age. The sight of an unfamiliar man approaching the bench caught the attention of the teachers. Their eyes narrowed in suspicion, a silent, collective decision to intervene if the need arose. However, before they could act, Issei lazily lifted one hand, as if dismissing the notion of danger entirely. "Don't worry, senseis," Issei said, his voice carrying a surprising calmness. "He's a family friend." The teachers hesitated but eventually returned to their duties, albeit with lingering glances. The man, now seated beside Issei, nodded in gratitude, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "Thanks for that, kid," he said, settling in as if he belonged there. Issei's response was a nonchalant shrug. "No problem," he said, leaning back further until he was almost lying down on the bench. The hat slipped forward to cover his face completely, and for a moment he seemed to drift off into his own world. The man studied the boy with a keen eye. "So," he began, "why aren't you out there with the rest of them? They're having the time of their lives." Issei let out a soft chuckle, the kind that came from someone far beyond his years. "Their version of fun and mine don't exactly align," he said, lifting his hat just enough to reveal one sharp, calculating eye. "I prefer experimenting with things. A bit more exciting, don't you think?" Azazel's interest was piqued. The boy spoke with an air of confidence and mischief that was uncommon, even unsettling for someone so young. "Is that so?" he mused, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "So, you want to be a scientist? Funny, I happen to be quite the scientist myself." The corner of Issei's mouth curled into a sly grin. He slowly sat up, his gaze now fully focused on Azazel. There was a sharpness in his eyes that spoke of both intelligence and caution. "Tell me," Issei said, his voice dropping slightly, "did you approach me with the intent of using me as one of your experiments?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment the playful atmosphere turned tense. Azazel blinked, then shook his head, a smile forming on his lips. "No, no," he assured the boy, "the thought hadn't crossed my mind." Issei's laughter broke the tension like a wave crashing against the shore. It was a laugh filled with delight, yet there was an edge to it that made Azazel raise an eyebrow. "Good to know, Azazel-san," Issei replied, his voice light once more. "But just so you know, I wouldn't mind experimenting on you. Fair trade, right? I get to poke around your mind and you get to poke around mine." Azazel's eyes narrowed slightly, surprised but impressed. The boy knew his name, had seen through him almost immediately, and now he was offering a deal as if they were equals. This was no ordinary child. "You know," Azazel began, his tone more serious, "you could be quite useful to me. How about we work together? You help me with my research and in return we can conduct a few interesting experiments." Issei didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately designed fan, which he opened with a flourish. "You've got yourself a deal," he said, his voice carrying a mischievous lilt as he fanned himself dramatically. Azazel couldn't help but chuckle. The boy's demeanor, the way he carried himself, it was clear that their experiments would be anything but ordinary. Dangerous, perhaps. Fun, absolutely. As the two sat together on the bench, the world around them seemed to fade away. leaving only the promise of thrilling discoveries and uncharted territories of knowledge. It was the beginning of a partnership that would one day shake the very foundations of the supernatural world, one experiment at a time. Breakthrough and confrontation. Time skip. In Azazel's lab. The air in Azazel's lab hummed with anticipation. The usually cluttered space, filled with ancient tomes, glowing vials, and half-constructed artifacts, was eerily quiet as Issei focused intently on the experiment before him. Azazel, lying in a specially designed chair, prepared himself for what could be a groundbreaking or a devastating test. Issei was about to test their latest theory on fallen angel purification. Shemhazai and Barakil, two of Azazel's closest comrades, stood nearby, their faces tight with concern. They couldn't shake the nagging fear gnawing at them. What if this experiment failed? The consequences could be dire. What if Azazel suffered irreversible damage or worse? "You're sure about this, Issei?" Shemhazai asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if raising it might tip the scales of fate. Issei waved a hand dismissively, his usual laid-back demeanor in full display. "Don't worry so much. Stress will give you wrinkles," he said, offering a small smirk before adjusting his hat slightly. "Besides, we've come too far to turn back now." Before anyone could respond, the lab door slid open with a soft hiss. Vali, the young and fierce white dragon emperor, strode in, his eyes immediately locking onto Issei. Vali, under the care of Azazel and Odin, had always been fascinated by Issei, though not for the same reasons others were. Where others saw a brilliant, albeit eccentric young scientist, Vali saw a potential rival. "I see you're playing doctor again, Issei," Vali remarked, his voice dripping with both curiosity and challenge. "Why don't you put down the test tubes and finally face me? You know we're destined to fight." Issei didn't even glance up, instead adjusting a dial on the machine next to Azazel. "Vali, as much as I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'm not interested in indulging your battle fantasies. Research is a far more productive use of my time." Azazel, lying still in the chair, managed a wry smile despite the tension in the room. "Vali, we're a bit busy at the moment. Perhaps another time." His voice was calm, but it held an underlying command. Vali's eyes narrowed, but he relented. "One day you won't be able to avoid it, Issei. We will fight." With that, he turned and left, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Issei let out a small sigh of relief, thankful to have avoided yet another of Vali's challenges. "Now, where were we?" he mused, more to himself than anyone else, before proceeding with the experiment. The process began smoothly. Issei skillfully manipulated the divine energy coursing through the apparatus, guiding it toward Azazel's black wings. The room was filled with a soft glow as one of Azazel's wings began to shift in color, slowly turning pure white. Barakil and Shemhazai exchanged hopeful glances, their worry momentarily forgotten. Issei smirked, watching the transformation with satisfaction. "Looks like our theory might actually work." But then, without warning, the divine energy went wild. The glow intensified, becoming blindingly bright as it surged out of control. Azazel's calm expression twisted into one of agony as he let out a pained scream, his body convulsing under the strain of the rogue energy. Shemhazai and Barakil moved to intervene, but Issei held up a hand, stopping them in their tracks. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice uncharacteristically stern. "Let him handle this." Azazel's body trembled as he struggled to contain the overwhelming power. His veins bulged against his skin, the divine energy coursing through him like liquid fire. For a few tense moments, it seemed as though he might not make it, but then, with a final, determined effort, Azazel managed to rein in the energy. A golden light enveloped him, pulsating with an almost holy aura. When the light finally faded, Azazel lay there, fully purified. His once dark wings were now a brilliant white, but his body showed signs of the tremendous strain it had undergone. His muscles twitched involuntarily, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Issei, ever unfazed, took out his fan and opened it with a snap, fanning himself leisurely. Well, that was a success. I'd say our hypothesis was correct, though the side effects might need some tweaking. Azazel glared at him, still struggling to catch his breath. Success? I almost died, you brat. Issei merely shrugged, hiding a grin behind his fan. But you didn't, and now you're all shiny and new. I'd say that's a win. Shemhazai and Barakil, though relieved, couldn't help but exchange exasperated looks. They knew Issei well enough to understand that this was just another day in the lab for him, a day filled with risky experiments, sharp intellect, and of course, a complete disregard for personal safety. An unseen presence suddenly descended upon the lab. The air grew heavy with divine energy, a power that was both familiar and formidable. Azazel, still recovering from the ordeal, sensed it immediately, and his gaze sharpened in recognition. The others in the room felt it too, and their bodies tensed in response. Within moments, the shimmering form of Archangel Michael materialized in the lab. His golden wings cast a soft glow that filled the room with an almost oppressive holiness. His green eyes, usually serene, were now narrowed in suspicion and anger. Michael had sensed the disturbance, and he had come to investigate. What he found only deepened his concern. Issei, who had been fanning himself, adjusted the brim of his hat, allowing it to cast a shadow over his eyes. His usually carefree expression was replaced with a more calculating look. The arrival of the leader of the angels was an unexpected twist, and one that Issei knew could easily escalate. His mind raced as he considered the potential outcomes. Barakil and Shemhazai, ever vigilant, instinctively moved into defensive positions, their hands glowing with light, ready to act if necessary. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Michael's gaze swept over the room before finally settling on Azazel, who had managed to stand despite the immense strain his body had undergone. The animosity between them was almost tangible, a bitter history that neither had fully put to rest. "What the hell are you doing, Azazel?" Michael's voice was cold, carrying the weight of millennia of leadership and judgment. There was no mistaking the anger in his tone, nor the disdain in his glare. Azazel met Michael's gaze without flinching, his eyes hard and unyielding. "What does it look like, Michael? We're conducting research." "Research?" Michael's wings flared slightly, the divine light intensifying as his power rose. Issei, sensing the situation was about to spiral out of control, stepped forward with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, gentlemen, let's not be hasty. We were just having a little fun, you know. Science and all that, nothing too serious." He waved his fan dismissively, attempting to lighten the mood. But the joke fell flat. Michael's glare turned icy as he snapped, "Silence, boy." His voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Barakil and Shemhazai, equally on edge, growled in unison, "Shut up, Issei." They had no patience for his antics at this moment. Issei recoiled dramatically, feigning a wounded expression as he brought his fan to his face. "So harsh. My poor, delicate feelings." He pretended to wipe away a tear and took a step back as if to leave. "Perhaps I should just excuse myself then." Before he could make his exit, Azazel's voice rang out, authoritative and commanding. "Stay, Issei." There was no room for argument in his tone, and Issei knew better than to push his luck any further. Michael's eyes narrowed further, his focus back on Azazel. "What exactly were you doing, Azazel?" he demanded once more, though now his voice carried a dangerous edge, his magic beginning to flare. Azazel didn't hesitate, meeting Michael's intensity with his own. "We've been working on a theory," he explained, his tone matter-of-fact despite the tension. "A theory to purify fallen angels and restore them to their original state." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Michael's reaction was immediate. His divine power surged, filling the lab with a crushing pressure. The ground beneath them cracked as the sheer force of his magic spiked, and the holy aura around him intensified to the point where even breathing became a struggle for those in the room. Michael's anger was evident. His power spiraled out of control as the implications of Azazel's words sank in. His wings unfurled fully, glowing with the intensity of a midday sun. "You dare meddle with such forces," he hissed, his voice echoing with the fury of 1,000 storms. As the holy pressure emanating from Michael reached its peak, the atmosphere in Azazel's lab became almost unbearable. The raw divine energy radiating from the Archangel was enough to make even the most seasoned warriors tremble. But not Issei. Instead of fear, a mischievous grin spread across his face. Beneath his usual laid-back demeanor, a devious plan was already forming in his mind. With a sly smile, Issei slowly removed his hat and held it in front of him. To the untrained eye, it appeared as though he was merely fidgeting, but those who knew him better, like Azazel, would recognize that something was brewing. Issei reached into the hat as though it were an endless inventory, his hand disappearing into its depths. He rummaged around for a moment before finally pulling out a small, unassuming button. Azazel, still locking glares with Michael, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye but chose not to react. He knew Issei well enough to understand that whatever he was planning, it would be nothing short of chaotic. Issei grinned, his fingers curling around the button. Without a word, he pressed it. In an instant, the air shimmered and a rift tore open in the fabric of reality. The rift expanded into a swirling vortex, and from it, a familiar figure appeared. Vali emerged from the portal, his eyes wide with confusion. He had just been in Asgard. How did he end up here? Issei's grin turned almost predatory as he waved the hat in front of Vali, treating the young white dragon emperor like a dog being summoned for playtime. "Vali, my friend, I've got a special treat for you. Sick 'em, boy," he said with a playful tone, pointing directly at Michael. Vali's eyes narrowed in annoyance at being treated like a pet, but any irritation was quickly overshadowed by the sight of the Archangel before him. Even at his young age, Vali could sense the overwhelming power radiating from Michael. A smirk slowly spread across his face as the thrill of a potential battle set his heart racing. TBC. One shot, one seal, one pact. Michael, sensing the new presence, turned his gaze to the young dragon emperor. His eyes briefly registered surprise, but then returned to their previous intensity, dismissing Vali as no real threat. "Azazel, are you so desperate that you're involving children in your foolish games?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Azazel, who had been watching the situation unfold with a mix of amusement and exasperation, couldn't help but chuckle. "Issei, you really know how to stir the pot, don't you?" he murmured under his breath. "Vali, stand down. This isn't your fight." But Vali was already stepped forward, his aura flaring with the raw, untamed power of a young dragon. "I don't care if he's an archangel or whatever," Vali declared, his voice filled with determination. "I want to see what he's made of." Issei, still grinning, leaned back and watched the scene unfold with a gleam in his eye. Whether or not the fight actually happened, he had succeeded in adding a little more chaos to an already tense situation. And for Issei, that was entertainment enough. Ignoring Azazel's warning, Vali activated his balance breaker. His form exploded with power, encasing him in the iconic white dragon armor which crackled with raw energy. The atmosphere grew charged, and for a brief moment, the lab seemed to shrink under the sheer intensity of Vali's presence. He knew he couldn't maintain the form for long, 10 minutes at best, but that was more than enough to prove himself, or so he thought. With a battle cry, Vali launched himself at Michael, the air around him distorting as his dragonic aura surged forward. Michael, however, met the boy's charge with a soft, almost pitying gaze. He saw not an enemy but a child, blinded by the lust for power. With a solemn sigh, he raised his hand, a brilliant light gathering in his palm. The next moment, the lab was illuminated by an intense flash. Michael's light blast struck Volley with the force of a divine hammer, shattering his dragon armor and sending the boy crashing into the wall, unconscious. The entire confrontation had lasted mere seconds. Azazel, who had been watching with a mixture of concern and exasperation, sighed deeply. "That boy never listens," he muttered, shaking his head. Issei, however, seemed entirely unbothered by the outcome. In fact, it was as if he had anticipated the one-sided defeat. With a nonchalant smirk, he revealed that he had been filming the entire exchange, holding up a small, high-tech recording device. "Oh, Volley's never gonna live this one down," he chuckled to himself, already planning how he would use the footage to taunt the Lucifer later. Deep within Issei's mind, DxD's voice erupted with a booming laugh that echoed through their shared consciousness. "Albion," DxD's voice rang out in a gleeful, mocking tone, "looks like your little host just got sent straight to dreamland, Albion. What was that, 8 seconds? Maybe less. Hilarious. I hope you enjoyed the nap because it looks like your boy did too." Issei could feel the amusement radiating from DxD, almost as if the dragon was shaking his head in disbelief. The mental image of Albion sulking in Volley's mind was too good to pass up. "Tell me, old friend," DxD continued, his tone dripping with smugness, "what happened to that mighty white dragon emperor? My partner here wouldn't get bodied like that, no sir. If it were us, we'd still be standing, maybe cracking a joke or two, while your boy's busy counting sheep." Issei couldn't help but grin as he mentally nudged DxD. "You really laid it on thick there, didn't you?" DxD chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, Albion knows it's all in good fun." As DxD's laughter echoed through the telepathic link, there was a long pause, the silence thick with tension. Then Albion's voice cut through, icy and sharp. "DxD, you overgrown lizard," Albion hissed, clearly annoyed but trying to maintain his usual calm. "One lucky shot doesn't make your host superior. Volley is a warrior, not a researcher who hides behind gadgets and experiments." The irritation in Albion's voice was apparent, and Issei could practically feel the white dragon emperor bristling on the other end. "Your host may be clever, DxD, but brains alone won't win battles. When the time comes, Volley will surpass him. Mark my words. Enjoy your little victory because it won't last. Next time it'll be your host eating dirt." DxD's amusement only grew with Albion's response. "Oh, Albion, you're so predictable. Always so serious, so focused on the next fight. But hey, you do you. Just don't forget to remind Volley that dodging is part of the job." Albion growled, his frustration clear. "Laugh while you can, DxD, but don't forget, the dragon of supremacy doesn't bow to anyone, not even your precious red dragon emperor." The telepathic link fell silent, leaving DxD with a satisfied smirk in Issei's mind. "Touchy, isn't he?" DxD commented, clearly relishing the exchange. "But I guess that's what happens when your pride takes a hit. Don't worry, Issei. Next time we'll make sure to rub it in even more." Back to the current situation. Michael's attention shifted to the others. Issei and Barakil, despite their strength, found themselves trembling under the overwhelming pressure of Michael's divine power. Barakil's fists clenched at his sides, and Issei's eyes darted nervously around the room. Azazel, on the other hand, remained composed, his expression passive yet watchful, while Issei simply smirked, unfazed by the Archangel's presence. "You've meddled enough, Azazel," Michael stated coldly, his voice resonating with divine authority as he began to charge another blast of light, aimed at Barakil and Issei. But before Michael could unleash his power, Issei casually reached into his coat and pulled out a medallion, one of the many magical artifacts he and Azazel had created in their countless experiments. The medallion began to glow with a soft, otherworldly light as Issei activated it, its magic working instantaneously. In an instant, Michael's power was halved, the immense aura that had filled the room dimming significantly. The divine energy that had been gathering in his hand flickered and dissipated. What? Michael's eyes narrowed as he glared at the young boy. What did you do? Issei held up the medallion with a triumphant grin. Oh, this. Just a little prototype Azazel and I cooked up. Its primary function is to seal the magic power of the target inside it. Quite handy, wouldn't you say? Azazel's eyes widened slightly at the mention of prototype. Prototype. Issei, that thing was barely functional when we created it. It was supposed to drain a small fraction of power, not. Issei chuckled, cutting him off. Yeah, I know. I did a little tinkering on the side and upgraded it, you could say. It doesn't just seal the power now, it also copies the target's abilities. Watch this. Without missing a beat, Issei raised the medallion and summoned a beam of light, identical to the one Michael had just attempted to use. The beam, though smaller and less intense than Michael's, was nonetheless a perfect imitation. Azazel couldn't help but smile with amusement. You've really outdone yourself this time, Issei. Michael, however, was far from amused. The realization that half of his power was now in the hands of this child, and that the boy had access to his abilities, made the situation far more precarious than he had anticipated. His instincts screamed at him to retreat. I'll retreat for now, he announced, his voice steady, though laced with frustration. But Issei, who was still brimming with confidence, wasn't about to let him off that easily. Oh no, you're not getting away that easily. Issei's voice carried a rare intensity as he stepped forward, the medallion still glowing in his hand. We're going to resolve this now. The tension in the room was thick as the two sides engaged in a heated discussion. Michael's anger was barely contained, as he demanded to know the full extent of Azazel's experiments. Azazel, ever the diplomat, promised to abandon the purification project, acknowledging that it was the fallen angels' fault for falling from grace and that they needed to accept the consequences of their actions. With Issei's clever persuasion, the conversation gradually shifted toward a more diplomatic resolution. They began to discuss the possibility of a non-aggression pact between the two angel factions. Michael, though still wary of Azazel and his protege, found himself begrudgingly agreeing to the terms. The peace that had eluded them for so long might finally be within reach. Before leaving, Michael turned to Issei, his expression serious. I hope you use your power for good, Issei Hayaudu. Your parents went through great hardship to bring you into this world. Do not disappoint them. You are their greatest gift. Issei's smirk faltered slightly at Michael's words. He knew exactly what the Archangel was referring to. His parents, particularly his mother Mickey, had faced unimaginable pain in their attempts to have a child. After 2 heartbreaking miscarriages, they had almost given up on the idea of starting a family. Yet against all odds, they had tried one last time, and Issei had been born, a miracle child, their greatest gift. As Michael disappeared, the lab fell into an uneasy silence. Azazel, Barakil, and Shemhazai exchanged glances, the weight of the encounter settling in. But Issei, ever the enigma, simply adjusted his hat and pocketed the medallion with a satisfied grin. Well, that was fun. Adventures in the underworld. Later that day, after the chaos had subsided, Issei sat comfortably in his room, his signature fan fluttering lazily in his hand as he leaned back in his chair. With a sly grin, he replayed the footage of Vali's brief, ill-fated charge against Michael. The scene was almost comical. Vali, with all the bravado of a future conqueror, launching himself at the Archangel only to be swatted down like a pesky fly. Issei's fingers danced over the keyboard, adding a few creative touches to the video. He zoomed in on Vali's determined face, and just before Michael's blast hit, Issei inserted a slow-motion effect, the sound of a dramatic, echoing heartbeat in the background. He overlaid Vali's voice, making his bold proclamation about putting Michael in his place echo like the battle cry of a hero about to face his greatest foe. It was all very epic, until Issei cut to the moment Vali was one-shotted. At that point, he added his own voiceover, dripping with mock sympathy. Damn, he got bodied. Issei couldn't help but chuckle at his handiwork. The contrast between Vali's fierce declaration and his humiliating defeat was just too perfect. Satisfied with the edits, Issei saved the file, naming it Vali's greatest moment, MP4 with an ironic flourish. Later, with Vali finally recovered and still nursing his wounded pride, Issei casually approached him, holding out his phone. "Hey, Vali," he began, trying to stifle a smirk. "You might want to see this. It's educational." Vali, still brooding, raised an eyebrow but took the phone. As the video played, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You edited this," Vali snapped, his face flushing with embarrassment as Issei's voice echoed in the background, mocking his defeat. Issei feigned innocence, his fan fluttering faster as if to wave away any responsibility. "Edited? No, I merely highlighted the key moments. It's all in good fun, Vali. Just think of it as a lesson in humility." Vali's hands clenched into fists, his dragonic aura flickering to life as his rage threatened to boil over. "You think this is funny, Issei? I swear, next time I'll—" "Next time," Issei cut him off with a mischievous grin. "Next time I'll bring a camera crew. We'll make it a blockbuster." Before Vali could respond, DxD's laughter filled the room, reverberating through Issei's mind and out into the open. "He's got a point, Vali. That was a hell of a performance. Maybe you'll get a rematch, but until then, well, let's just say Issei's got some great material for our highlight reel." Vali's glare could have melted steel, but Issei just waved his fan dismissively, unfazed. "Come on, lighten up. Besides, if you ever do manage to put Michael in his place, I promise to give it the full Hollywood treatment." Vali, fuming but knowing there was little he could do now, gritted his teeth and shoved the phone back at Issei. "This isn't over, Issei. Next time I'll be the one making the video, and trust me, you won't like how it ends." Issei simply smiled, pocketing his phone. "I'll be waiting." Few weeks later, the crisp mountain air filled Issei's lungs as he and Azazel made their way up the winding path to Dragon Mountain. The craggy peaks loomed above them, shrouded in mist, and the distant roars of dragons echoed through the valleys, reminding them of the ancient power that resided here. This was no ordinary mountain. It was connected to the territory of the Gremory clan, entrusted to the Dragon King Tannen, who ruled over the many dragons that had once roamed the human world. The very air hummed with the weight of ancient magic, and Issei's eyes gleamed with anticipation under the brim of his hat. Azazel's mind was fixated on his goal. He sought to form a contract with one of the 5 dragon kings, Fafnir. The purpose was clear. Fafnir was to be sealed in an immensely powerful sacred gear, one that Azazel and Issei had created together. The thought of securing such a mighty dragon's power filled Azazel with a thrill of anticipation, though his face remained composed as ever. Issei, on the other hand, had his own reasons for coming to Dragon Mountain, reasons that he kept to himself, his mind already ticking with the possibilities. As they approached the peak, the ground beneath them rumbled slightly, a deep, resonant growl emanating from within the mountain. Suddenly, a massive golden figure emerged from the mist. Fafnir, the legendary Dragon King, stood before them. The dragon's towering form, more than 10 meters tall, gleamed like polished gold in the sunlight. Unlike most Western dragons, Fafnir lacked wings, but his sheer size and presence more than compensated for it. A single horn protruded from the tip of his nose, glinting dangerously as he regarded the 2 visitors with keen, intelligent eyes. The very air seemed to crackle with energy as Fafnir lowered his head slightly, his gaze fixed on Issei. "I sense an old presence within you," Fafnir's voice boomed in their minds, deep and resonant. "DxD, is that you?" DxD stirred within Issei, his voice rising to meet his old acquaintance. "It's been a long time, Fafnir. Still holding your ground, I see." Fafnir let out a rumbling laugh that echoed through the mountains. "I've kept myself busy. And what of this boy? Is he truly your host?" "Yes," DxD answered, his tone tinged with pride. Issei is unlike any host I've had before. He's sharp, resourceful, and unpredictable. Fafnir's eyes narrowed as he considered the proposal. I will accept your contract, on one condition. Azazel's heart skipped a beat. He had expected a challenge. And what condition would that be? The air seemed to grow colder as Fafnir's massive form shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving Issei. I want to test this host of D-Drags. If he fights me and survives, I will accept the contract. Azazel's heart sank. He knew Issei's distaste for combat, but Fafnir's challenge was non-negotiable. He turned to Issei, a pleading look in his eyes. Issei, I need you to do this, just this once. I'll owe you a favor, anything you want. Issei's expression remained neutral, though a spark of mischief danced in his eyes. He tilted his hat back slightly, his voice smooth and laid back as always. You know, Azazel, I'm really more of a lover than a fighter, but a favor, you say. Azazel felt a chill run down his spine as Issei's lips curled into an evil grin. He could only imagine the twisted experiments that might result from such a promise. Yes, a favor, Azazel repeated, his voice slightly trembling. Issei let out a slow, deliberate chuckle, his eyes narrowing as he relished the moment. Fine, fine. I'll fight your dragon, but remember, Azazel, you owe me big time. Azazel nodded, pale and apprehensive, already regretting the favor he had just offered. As Issei turned to face Fafnir, the mountain air grew heavy with anticipation. Before the fight began, Issei casually tossed a small camera to Azazel, who caught it with a raised eyebrow. Make sure you get my good side, Issei said with a smirk. I'm about to show Vali how it's done, and let Albion know I'm more versatile than he thinks. Azazel chuckled, turning the camera on and pointing it toward the battlefield. Break a leg, kid. Without warning, Fafnir lunged forward, his enormous body moving with surprising speed. The ground shook beneath his weight, cracks spiderwebbing out from where his claws dug into the earth. His maw opened wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth as he aimed to engulf Issei in a single, devastating bite. But Issei was no ordinary opponent. As Fafnir closed in, Issei's eyes gleamed with excitement. He sidestepped with a burst of speed, the air around him distorting as he activated his Shikai. His Zanpakuto, Benayam, hummed in his hand as he swung it, releasing a crescent-shaped wave of crimson energy that sliced through the air toward Fafnir. Scream, Benayam, Issei commanded, his voice calm yet deadly. The blast collided with Fafnir's scales, exploding in a burst of red light. The Dragon King roared, more in annoyance than pain, as the attack left only a faint scorch mark on his otherwise impenetrable hide. Fafnir turned his massive head, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Issei with a newfound respect. You are quick, boy, Fafnir rumbled, his voice vibrating through the ground. But speed alone will not save you. Fafnir inhaled deeply, the air around him distorting as he gathered his immense power. With a deafening roar, he unleashed a torrent of golden flames, the heat so intense that the very air seemed to ignite. The flames surged toward Issei, threatening to engulf him completely. Issei's response was immediate. He raised his left hand, and the boosted gear's gauntlet flared to life, its red gem glowing brightly. Boost! The word echoed through the mountains as Issei channeled his power into a protective barrier, the flames crashing against it with a force that made the earth tremble. The barrier held, but only just. Issei gritted his teeth as the heat washed over him, sweat dripping down his brow. He knew Fafnir was holding back. This was merely a test of his strength. But Issei wasn't one to be underestimated. With a quick motion, Issei dispelled the barrier and launched himself forward, using Shunpo to close the distance between him and Fafnir in the blink of an eye. He swung Benayam in a wide arc, aiming for the Dragon King's exposed underbelly. But Fafnir was ready. With a flick of his tail, he swatted Issei away, sending him crashing into a nearby cliffside. Issei grunted as he pulled himself from the rubble, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. Not bad, but I'm just getting started. Issei's eyes narrowed as he focused on Fafnir, his hand tightening around Benayem's hilt. He knew he had to step up his game if he wanted to impress the Dragon King. With a deep breath, Issei allowed his power to surge through him, the ground around him cracking from the sheer pressure of his power. Fafnir watched as Issei's aura flared, his interest peaked. The boy's energy was potent, far beyond that of a typical human. It was clear that DxD's host was not to be taken lightly. Issei raised Benayem above his head, the blade glowing with an intense crimson light. "Camisari, Benayem," he shouted, bringing the sword down in a swift motion. A blinding beam of energy shot forward, slicing through the air. The attack was so fast and powerful that it seemed to tear reality itself as it hurtled toward Fafnir. Fafnir's eyes widened, and he quickly brought up his massive claws to block the attack. The beam collided with his scales, sending a shockwave through the mountain. For a moment, it seemed as though Issei's attack might break through, but Fafnir's scales held firm, though they were left glowing hot from the impact. With a growl, Fafnir retaliated, swiping his claws at Issei with enough force to rend the earth apart. Issei dodged, using Shunpo to appear behind the Dragon King, but Fafnir was prepared. He whipped around, his tail coming at Issei like a battering ram. Issei barely had time to react as the tail slammed into him, sending him skidding across the ground. He quickly regained his footing, his breath coming in heavy pants. Issei wiped the sweat from his brow, his smirk never fading. Fafnir was a formidable opponent, but that only fueled Issei's determination. He focused his energy, the boosted gear on his arm pulsing with power. Boost! The gauntlet responded to his call, quadrupling his power. Fafnir, noticing the increase in Issei's energy, let out a deep, resonant growl. "You're quite the tenacious one, aren't you, boy?" His eyes flashed with a mixture of amusement and challenge. "Very well, let's see how you handle this." The Dragon King's body began to glow with a golden aura, the ground beneath him starting to crack and crumble as his power surged. Fafnir reared back, his massive form towering over the landscape, before slamming both of his forelimbs into the ground. The earth trembled violently as massive spires of rock erupted from the ground, each one sharp enough to pierce through steel. Issei's eyes widened as the spires shot toward him, forcing him to dodge and weave between them. He barely managed to avoid being skewered by the deadly pillars, his speed and agility being put to the ultimate test. But Issei wasn't done yet. With a deft flick of his wrist, he released a barrage of energy blasts from Benayem, each one aimed at the base of the spires. The blasts exploded on impact, shattering the rock formations and sending debris flying in every direction. Fafnir roared in frustration, his golden eyes blazing with anger. The Dragon King spread his claws wide, summoning a torrent of wind that swept across the battlefield. The gusts were so powerful that they uprooted trees and sent boulders tumbling down the mountainside. Issei braced himself against the wind, his feet digging into the ground to keep from being blown away. He knew he had to act fast if he wanted to turn the tide of the battle. Issei prepared his next move. "Kechimiyaku, Benayem," Issei shouted, slashing his sword through the air. A crimson chain shot out from the blade, wrapping around Fafnir's forelimb with incredible speed. The chain glowed with a fiery light as Issei poured his energy into it, the crimson aura pulsating with power. Fafnir's eyes narrowed as he felt the chain constrict around him, its energy biting into his scales. With a snarl, he pulled against the chain, his immense strength causing the ground to quake. But Issei held firm, using every ounce of his power to keep the chain in place. Fafnir, feeling the constraint of Issei's magic, let out a deafening roar that echoed through the mountains. His eyes blazed with an intense, golden light as he called upon his great draconic power. The air around him shimmered with heat as he began to channel his energy into a single, devastating attack. Issei could feel the immense power building within Fafnir, and he knew he had to act fast. With a burst of shunpo, he closed the distance between them, reappearing right in front of the Dragon King. "Scream, Benayam," he cried, releasing another powerful wave of crimson energy. But Fafnir was ready. With a quick movement, he unleashed a shockwave of golden energy that collided with Issei's attack. The two forces clashed in midair, creating a massive explosion that sent Issei flying backward. Issei skidded across the ground, his body battered and bruised from the impact. He struggled to his feet, his breathing heavy. The Dragon King's eyes locked onto him with a mixture of respect and ferocity. "You're stronger than I anticipated, boy," Fafnir rumbled, his voice echoing through the battlefield. "But this is far from over." Issei grinned, despite the pain radiating through his body. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Fafnir let out another roar, the ground shaking as he charged forward with renewed fury. His claws slashed through the air, each strike powerful enough to cleave through mountains. Issei dodged and parried as he danced around the Dragon King's attacks. Fafnir's eyes gleamed with ancient power as he took a deep breath, calling upon his immense treasure hoard. The very air around him shimmered with golden light as the ground beneath his feet began to crack open, revealing a swirling vortex of riches, a testament to his age and might. From the depths of this vortex, weapons of pure gold emerged, swords, spears, shields, and cannons, all of which radiated an overwhelming aura of power. "You've done well to push me this far, boy," Fafnir rumbled, his voice resonating with both pride and warning. "But now, witness the power of a true Dragon King." With a flick of his claw, the golden weapons launched toward Issei, each one moving with a speed and precision that belied their massive size. It was as if the weapons had minds of their own, each one targeting Issei with lethal intent. Fafnir didn't stop there. The golden cannons appeared next, hovering around the Dragon King before unleashing devastating beams of energy that scorched the very earth they touched. Issei's eyes widened as the battlefield was consumed by golden light. He had no time to admire the majesty of Fafnir's treasure. His focus was entirely on survival. The boosted gear on his arm pulsed with power, and Issei knew he needed to tap into everything he had if he wanted to survive this onslaught. "Balance breaker," Issei roared, the boosted gear transforming as red scales covered his body, amplifying his strength and speed tenfold. The moment the transformation completed, Issei's spatial magic flared to life, distorting the space around him as he began to teleport and dodge Fafnir's relentless assault. But the Dragon King wasn't finished. As Issei narrowly avoided another barrage of golden energy, Fafnir summoned even more weapons from his hoard, the air now thick with golden armaments. The sky itself seemed to glow under the sheer number of treasures at Fafnir's command. Issei's mind raced as he realized he couldn't rely on dodging alone. He needed to take the fight to Fafnir, but how could he get close with so many weapons aimed at him? His gaze fell on Benayam, his trusted Zanpakuto, and a plan began to form. Issei unleashed a high-powered Kamisari. The attack tore through Fafnir's treasures and space itself. The attack forced Fafnir to dodge. Issei seized the opportunity. With a burst of shunpo, he closed the distance between himself and Fafnir, raising Benayam high. "Kechimiaku, Benayam!" The crimson chain shot out once more, wrapping around Fafnir's massive form, binding him in place. But Issei didn't stop there. He poured his energy into the chain, intensifying its power until the air around it sizzled with heat. Fafnir snarled as the chain constricted around him, the dragon's golden scales glowing from the strain. But even as his power surged, Fafnir was far from defeated. With a mighty roar, he summoned the last of his golden arsenal, the remaining weapons converging on Issei from all directions. Issei's heart pounded in his chest as he realized he was out of time. There was only one way to break through this final assault, and he had to act now. "Benayam, Shibari," Issei commanded, and the crimson chain binding Fafnir suddenly expanded, forming a barrier of energy around them. For a brief moment the battlefield was silent, the golden weapons clashing against the barrier but unable to break through. Fafnir's eyes widened as he felt the drain on his power. This boy. He wasn't just strong, he was a genius in battle, using every ounce of his energy and intelligence to counter the Dragon King's might. Outrage, Fafnir growled, his voice filled with power. His body began to glow with an intense light as he entered his outrage mode, wings sprouting from his back and his power skyrocketing. His golden scales became even more radiant, and his aura grew to encompass the entire mountain, the sheer force of it pushing Issei back. Issei's eyes widened as he felt Fafnir's power increase exponentially. He knew he was facing a Dragon King at his peak. If that's how it's going to be, ban, Issei began, but his words were cut off by a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. "DxD, you bastard, I'm going to kill you." The voice was filled with such fury and power that it made the air vibrate, and even Fafnir in his outrage mode paused, his eyes widening in shock. "Tiamat," DxD's voice echoed in Issei's mind, panic clear in the usually confident dragon's tone. Before Issei could process what was happening, a figure descended from the sky, landing with a grace that belied the raw power radiating from her. She was a vision of celestial beauty, pale blue hair cascading down her back, eyes like deep sapphires that held both wisdom and wrath, and a presence that made even the earth itself bow in submission. This was Tiamat, the Chaos Karma Dragon, and the strongest of the 5 Dragon Kings. Fafnir, for all his might and fury, wisely decided that this battle was no longer his to fight. With a final glance at Issei, the Dragon King turned to Azazel. "I accept the contract, Azazel," Fafnir said, his voice still tinged with the power of his outrage mode, but now carrying a note of caution. He knew better than to challenge Tiamat when she was in this state. Azazel smirked, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction even as the atmosphere grew more dangerous. "Excellent. Let's finalize the pact, shall we?" With that, Azazel and Fafnir disappeared. After Azazel and Fafnir departed, an oppressive silence settled over the area, broken only by the crackle of lingering energy in the air. Issei stood tensely as Tiamat's piercing gaze bore into him, her fury apparent. DxD apologized to Tiamat for losing her treasure. But the apology was futile. Tiamat's wrath wasn't something easily placated, especially not by mere words. She fixed Issei with a cold, unforgiving stare. "DxD, your apologies are as worthless as ever," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "And you?" Her eyes narrowed as she shifted her focus to Issei, her aura growing even more menacing. "You're just as guilty by association." Issei chuckled lightly, almost mockingly at her hostility. But before he could react further, Tiamat vanished from her spot, reappearing before him in an instant. Her fist connected with his chest, and the force of the blow shattered his dragon armor like glass. Issei was sent crashing to the ground, blood spurting from his mouth as he struggled to breathe. "Screw you, DxD," Issei gasped out, wincing in pain as he lay sprawled on the ground. "I'm sorry for putting you in this situation, DxD." But Tiamat wasn't done. She appeared near Issei and raised her foot, intent on finishing Issei off with a crushing stomp. However, as her foot came down, it triggered the trap Issei had set after her punch. The ground beneath them glowed with a complex magic circle, binding Tiamat's movements and halting her in her tracks. Tiamat's eyes widened in surprise, and her aura flared dangerously as she tried to break free. But Issei had anticipated this, and with a quick motion, he activated the medallion. The medallion glowed ominously as it drained and sealed away 2/3 of Tiamat's immense power. Even with her power restricted, Tiamat's sheer will was formidable. She unleashed a pulse of her remaining aura, shattering the magic circle and freeing herself. Her glare was deadly as she locked eyes with Issei, who was now standing with a menacing smile on his face. "Time for payback," Issei declared, his voice cold and steady. "Bankai Kanambaraki Benayam Aratame." Tiamat's eyes widened in shock as Issei's Bankai manifested behind him. The entire area fell under the influence of Issei's Bankai, its power warping reality itself. Tiamat roared in fury, unleashing a torrent of flames at Issei, but the flames split harmlessly around him, diverted by the effect of his Bankai. Issei smirked. "You're stronger, Tiamat, no doubt, but don't underestimate me." Tiamat, enraged, blitzed toward Issei at incredible speed, but her momentum was abruptly halted as Canon Baraki Benayim Aratame's power came into play. In an instant, Tiamat's legs were severed from her body, the Dragon King's form being methodically split apart until only her upper body remained. Breathing heavily, Tiamat glared up at Issei with a mixture of shock and anger as he approached her, his expression calm yet intense. "Relax," Issei said coolly. "I'm not going to kill you." He crouched down beside her. "I'm willing to make amends. I'll give you treasure, rare magical items, anything to make up for what DxD did to you." Tiamat's eyes flickered with reluctance before she begrudgingly nodded. "Fine," she muttered, "but this doesn't mean I forgive you or DxD." Issei smiled and released his Bankai. As the effects of his power faded, Tiamat's body was restored, her form returning to its full, unscathed state. But the toll on Issei was great. The moment his Bankai dissipated, exhaustion overtook him and he collapsed to the ground. Before Tiamat could react, a ripple in the air signaled the arrival of another presence, Ajuka Beelzebub. The demon lord surveyed the scene with mild interest before directing a smirk at the Dragon King. "Quite an interesting display," Ajuka commented, his tone almost amused as he looked at the unconscious Issei. "This boy certainly has potential." Tiamat's fierce gaze softened slightly as she addressed Ajuka, "Don't harm him." Ajuka chuckled, gently lifting Issei's limp body. "You worry too much, Tiamat. I won't lay a hand on him." He teleported away, taking Issei with him, leaving Tiamat alone to ponder the strange and powerful human who had bested her. 4. When Issei finally stirred, the first thing he noticed was the sterile, metallic scent of a lab. Blinking groggily, he slowly sat up, taking in his surroundings. Sleek consoles, glowing with arcane symbols and equations, lined the walls. Strange devices and vials of unknown substances were meticulously arranged on polished tables. It didn't take long for Issei to realize where he was, or rather, whose domain he was in. Standing nearby was Ajuka Beelzebub, one of the four great Satans, casually observing Issei with an analytical yet warm gaze. His presence was unmistakable, especially after all the stories and descriptions Issei had heard from Azazel. "Ah, you're awake," Ajuka greeted with a smile that was both welcoming and subtly calculating. Issei met his gaze, stretching his sore muscles slightly before speaking. "Well, well, if it isn't the great Lord Beelzebub," he said, his tone light, but with a hint of caution. "What would someone like you want with little old me?" Ajuka chuckled softly at Issei's quip, appreciating the boy's bravado despite the circumstances. "I'm interested in you, Issei Hayaudu," he began, his voice smooth and even. "Your abilities, your mind, the potential you've shown, not just as the Red Dragon Emperor but as someone who could change the world. I find it intriguing." Issei's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Ajuka. The man was famous not just for his power, but for his intelligence, his endless curiosity, and his willingness to explore uncharted territories, both scientific and magical. But despite his fame, Ajuka seemed relaxed, almost casual, as if this conversation was simply between two like-minded individuals. "And what exactly interests you?" Issei asked, leaning back slightly. "I'm just a guy with a boosted gear who happened to catch the wrong end of Tiamat's wrath." Ajuka's smile widened just a fraction. "You're far more than that," he replied, a gleam of interest in his eyes. "Your actions, your ideas, especially the way you handled Tiamat, that wasn't just luck or brute strength. It was strategy, clever use of magic, and an understanding of your opponent that few your age possess. You're a thinker, Issei, and that's what makes you fascinating. The two continued talking, their conversation flowing naturally as they discussed a range of topics, from the complexities of sacred gear mechanics to the potential of merging modern science with ancient magic. Ajuka found it refreshing to converse with someone who could keep up with his thoughts, who understood the nuance and depth of his theories. Issei, for his part, was surprised by how easily he connected with Ajuka. Ajuka paused for a moment, his gaze flicking to one of the monitors displaying a stream of data. You know, he began thoughtfully, there are few people in this world I can talk to like this. Most either don't understand the intricacies or they're too rigid in their thinking. But you, Issei, you're different. You're adaptable, open-minded. I believe we could achieve great things together. Issei smirked. Is that a job offer? Ajuka laughed, the sound genuine and light. Not quite, he said, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't see the potential for collaboration. You're someone who sees the world differently, and that's invaluable. As they continued to delve into more complex topics, from theoretical applications of magic in modern technology to the ethical implications of certain types of research, the door to the lab slid open silently, revealing a tall figure with long crimson hair. Surzech Lucifer, another of the four great Satans, entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Ajuka greeted his friend with a smirk, a sign of their long-standing camaraderie. Surzech, he said warmly, I was wondering when you'd show up. Surzech returned the greeting with a smile, his gaze shifting to the young man sitting across from Ajuka. And who might this be? He asked, his tone curious but friendly. Ajuka gestured toward Issei. This, he said with a hint of pride, is Issei Hyaudu, the current Red Dragon Emperor. Surzech raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. The Red Dragon Emperor, here in your lab, Ajuka. Are you recruiting him for something? Ajuka shook his head, a playful glint in his eyes. No, not exactly. I've offered him a place in my peerage before, but he refused. However, we're discussing working together on some projects. He has a mind that's well suited for the kind of research I'm interested in. Issei chuckled softly, catching Surzech's attention. I'm quite the scientist myself, you know, he said, his tone carrying a mix of humility and pride. Surzech regarded him for a moment, sensing something beyond the boy's casual demeanor. There was a sharpness in Issei's eyes, a depth that suggested he wasn't one to be underestimated. I see, Surzech said finally, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It seems Ajuka has found himself an interesting partner. They talked for a while longer, Surzech joining the conversation and adding his own insights. It was a rare moment, three individuals from vastly different backgrounds, yet all sharing a common interest in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The exchange of ideas was rapid, filled with both humor and serious contemplation. Eventually, Issei decided it was time to leave. Rising to his feet, he stretched, feeling the weight of the day's events catching up to him. As he turned to go, he casually tossed a small object toward Ajuka, who caught it effortlessly. It was a sleek, high-tech phone, customized in a way that made even Ajuka raise an eyebrow in interest. Keep in touch, Issei said with a grin. We've got a lot to discuss. Ajuka smiled, slipping the phone into his pocket. Indeed we do, he agreed. Surzech watched as Issei exited the lab, his expression thoughtful. He's something else, isn't he? He remarked to Ajuka. Ajuka nodded, his gaze following Issei until he was out of sight. Yes, he replied quietly, and I have a feeling he's going to change a lot more than just our little world. With that, Ajuka and Surzech exchanged a glance, both recognizing that they had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. After his meeting with Ajuka and Surzech, Issei found himself heading back to Azazel's lab, his mind buzzing with the possibilities they had discussed. The collaboration was just beginning, but he could already sense the monumental impact their work would have on the future. Upon entering the lab, Issei was greeted by Azazel, who looked up from his workbench with a sly grin. "Well, well, well. Looks like the kid came back in one piece," Azazel teased, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "I take it you survived your little playdate with Tiamat." Before Azazel could react, Issei propelled himself forward, delivering a devastating dropkick to his face with both legs. Azazel staggered backward, crashing into a pile of books and metal scraps. "Some help would have been nice, you lazy bastard," Issei grumbled as he landed gracefully, shaking off the dust from his clothes. Azazel rubbed his bruised face, trying not to laugh. "Heh, looks like I hit a nerve." Azazel rubbed his jaw, sitting back up and laughing as a golden glow shimmered on his hand. The light pulsed faintly, indicating the presence of Fafnir, who now resided within Azazel's sacred gear. "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you return," Fafnir's deep voice echoed from the glow. "Tiamat is far stronger than me, and after our little tussle, I assumed you'd be thoroughly exhausted." Issei rolled his eyes, his expression shifting to one of dry amusement. "You're really underestimating me here, aren't you? Not only did I survive, but I had a little chat with Tiamat." Just then Vali entered the lab. He had just returned from Asgard, and his eyes immediately went to the sacred gear on Azazel's hand. Albion, sensing Fafnir's presence, stirred within Vali. "Fafnir," Albion rumbled, "I see you've chosen to reside in a sacred gear now. What made you take that route?" Fafnir chuckled, a sound both amused and dismissive. "Curiosity, mostly." Issei smirked, the moment of tension broken by his amusement. He turned to Azazel, extending a hand. "Hand it over." Azazel raised a brow. "What?" "The camera, you know, the one you filmed the fight with." Issei's smirk deepened. "Time to show Vali how it's done." With a chuckle, Azazel tossed him the camera. Issei caught it deftly and brought up the footage. Vali leaned in, watching the screen as images of Issei's battle with Fafnir played out. "You fought one of the 5 Dragon Kings." Vali's disbelief was evident, his eyes wide as the footage rolled on. His gaze shifted to Azazel, and for once, there was a hint of a pout in the White Dragon Emperor's voice. "Why didn't you take me along?" Issei chuckled darkly, leaning back with a smirk. "Oh, come on, Vali. We wouldn't want you getting bodied again like that time with Michael, right?" His tone was dripping with mockery, the jab too sweet to resist. Vali's eyes narrowed dangerously, his lips curving into a thin line. "I'll make you eat those words, Issei." But Issei wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, his smirk turning even more wicked. "I didn't just fight Fafnir, you know. I went toe-to-toe with Tiamat and lived to tell the tale." He let that sink in before adding, "And in case you're wondering, yeah, I defeated her." Azazel and Fafnir both went silent for a moment, eyes widening in shock. "You defeated Tiamat?" Azazel's voice was incredulous. Fafnir for the first time was speechless, the strongest of the Dragon Kings, and Issei had won. Issei grinned, enjoying their stunned reactions. "We came to a bit of an understanding afterward. Let's just say I'll be offering her some compensation for D-Drake's past screw-ups, treasure, magic items, the works." 2 days later, Issei and Azazel found themselves meeting with Ajuka. As the devil scientist and one of the 4 great Satans arrived, both Ajuka and Azazel shared looks of mutual surprise. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" Ajuka remarked, glancing between Issei and Azazel. "I didn't expect the 2 of you to be working together." Azazel raised an eyebrow. "That's funny. I was just about to say the same thing about you. Meeting with one of the 4 great Satans was not on my to-do list today." Before the tension in the air could escalate, Issei stepped forward, clapping his hands together. "All right, you two. Let's break the ice here. We're all going to be working together from now on, so let's not act like strangers." Ajuka's gaze softened as he regarded Issei. Bold words for someone so young. Azazel meanwhile chuckled. "He's got a point, though. Might as well skip the formalities. We're going to be knee-deep in research soon enough." The trio exchanged glances before finally settling into the conversation. What began as a cautious meeting quickly evolved into a full-blown brainstorming session. Ajuka and Azazel, two of the greatest minds of their generation, bouncing ideas off each other while Issei contributed with his own insights. The three of them began discussing cutting-edge technology, cures for diseases thought to be incurable, how to improve rating games and creating VR games. Meanwhile, in his private time, Issei was busy working on his own side projects, countermeasures for the various supernatural races, plagues and diseases that could bring entire factions to their knees if need be. His mind was a web of intrigue and invention, constantly spinning new ideas that could change the world for better or worse. Over time, Issei became closer to both Ajuka and Surzech. With Azazel, they discussed a potential peace treaty between the factions, though they knew all too well that not everyone would support it. Issei's extracurricular activities had taken a darker turn. He had begun hunting stray devils, not for sport, but for experimentation. Each stray he captured was another piece of his intricate puzzle, their abilities and physiology dissected and repurposed for his personal research. One day, Issei tracked a particularly notorious stray devil, Kuroka. He had tracked her down with the full intent of capturing her for his experiments. The air around them crackled with tension, but there was also a strange familiarity in the way they regarded each other. Well, if it isn't the famous stray devil Kuroka. Fancy meeting you here, Issei said, tipping his hat slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Kuroka crossed her arms, smirking back. Cut the act, Kisuke, she said pointedly, recognizing his attire and demeanor. Issei chuckled, adjusting his hat. Call me by my current name now, will you? It's Issei. Kuroka's expression softened slightly, her eyes flickering with recognition. Issei, huh? So what have you been up to, besides chasing strays like me? Issei shrugged, his smirk returning. I've got a lot on my plate, working with Azazel and Ajuka, and oh yeah, I'm the Red Dragon Emperor now. Kuroka raised an eyebrow. Red Dragon Emperor, so you've come up in the world. And what about you? Issei asked, leaning against a nearby wall. What's life like for a stray these days? Kuroka's grin faltered slightly as she glanced away. I've been taking care of my sister, Shiren, Kaneko, as she's called now. She doesn't know the whole story, but I've been keeping an eye on her from a distance. The two exchanged stories, catching up on all that had happened in their lives. Kuroka leaned against a nearby wall, her eyes glinting with amusement. So, what's the plan now, Issei? Issei shrugged, his grin never faltering. Who knows, but one thing's for sure, things are about to get a lot more interesting.